Good morning. Music. I love music. I appreciate the chance. Marty, thanks so much for the kind introduction. For all of you here live and in person, for giving me a chance to come by and share some thoughts. I understand we have some folks who zoomed in from around the country, maybe even around the world, maybe even from Delaware. I take the train to work back and forth almost every day, and took my first train ride when I was 5 years old. My grandfather and grandmother lived in, we were born in Beckley, West Virginia. It's a coal mining town. And we would go, even later on in our lives, my sister and I always go back there for the summers and stay with our grandparents and cousins and all. Probably did that as kids too. But one day, my sister and I went out right out the front door of our grandparents' house, and there's a fence, and then the other side of the fence is railroad track. And every morning about 10 o'clock, a train would come by, a freight train would come by, slowly. And my sister and I would stand by the fence and jump up and down, pump our arms, trying to get the engineer to acknowledge our presence and blow the whistle. And more often than not, he did. One morning, my sister and I, there's a time for the train, we went out to the fence. Here comes the train. We're jumping up and down, pumping our fists, and the train stops right in front of us. And we were just like eyes wide open, mouths dropped. And off the train comes our grandfather. It was his train. He worked for the B&O Railroad. And he unlocked the gate and he said, "Come on, let's go for a ride." And he lifted us up on the train and we took off down the tracks. We went about 500 miles. That was about 500 feet. And we stopped, the train stopped, and he let us off the train. He said, "Run back to the house. Do not tell your grandmother about this." We ran back to the house as fast as we could. We ran up the steps into the house. "Grandma, you'll never guess what Grandpa did." "You know he didn't. He'll go to jail for this." That was my first train ride. And I'm now 76 years old, and I probably put more miles on the Amtrak on a passenger rail than just about anybody in the country. But I love, that's how I get to work. I get to live in Delaware, live with my wife, Martha, where we've raised 3 boys, and delighted to be able to join all of you today. I just want to start off by saying this. For those around the country who are involved in creating jobs, beginning businesses, running businesses, make them successful, thank you for what you do with your lives. I hope that the work you do provides satisfaction and joy for you as much as mine does for me. I'm honored to be able to follow Shelley Capito, another West Virginia kid, and I think I'm going to hear from another one. Joe Manchin is like, my mom used to say, things happen in threes. Well, they do this morning for all of you, but we're happy to have a chance to share some of our thoughts on a really important subject, and that is permitting reform. And it's my privilege to join Shelley is to serve as the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and you heard from Shelley just a few minutes ago. I don't know if we like each other. I know you think most of us in Democrats and Republicans, we hate each other. We're just looking for ways to make one another look foolish or dumb, and that's just not the truth. In the Senate, for the most part, we abide by the principle that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. That drives me, that drives Shelley, and I think that certainly drives Joe. But I'm committed to ensuring access to clean air and clean water for all Americans, regardless of their zip code. And that said, I've always believed that we can do this while fostering economic growth and prosperity. I think to say we can't have both a better planet, a safer planet, clean air, clean water, and jobs, I think that's a false choice. We can do both. In fact, we must do both if we're going to have a quality of life on this planet. What you may not know is that my commitment to these principles runs deep. Before I was elected to public office, I think Marty may have mentioned my first job. I was a naval flight officer for many years. And do we have any? I don't know if any veterans here. We got put your hands together for our veterans that are here. Go ahead. But I had the opportunity to serve in Southeast Asia and around the world, tracking Soviet nuclear submarines in every ocean of the world and flying low-level missions off the coast of Vietnam and Cambodia. And I left the Navy after a number of years and had a chance to move to Delaware, get an MBA And my first job was working for the Delaware Division of Economic Development. And I learned how to help not just recruit companies to come to Delaware, but how to make sure that they were prosperous and able to provide returns for those who invested in the companies, but also to provide for the folks who work for those companies and those who are served by those companies. I had the good fortune of serving as governor for 8 years. Followed people like Pete DuPont, followed people like Mike Castle, a couple of Republicans who are good friends and great role models for me. And one of the things I focused on throughout these was job creation, job preservation. As a governor, more jobs were created, I'm told, in my 8 years as governor than any 8-year period in the history of the state of Delaware. I did not create one of them, but we worked hard to create a nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation. I'll talk more about that later. But those experiences became the foundation of my leadership on Environmental Public Works Committee, where we're proud of our strong record of bipartisan success. To me, there is no question that Congress has an important role to play in supporting the deployment of clean energy projects across our country. And why, you might ask, but well, to put it simply, we're running out of time to address the greatest threat that we're currently faced on our planet, and that's the climate crisis. The greatest threat, but also a great opportunity, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is personal to those of us who live in the first state. Delaware is the lowest lying state in the country. Our state is sinking. Seas around us are rising. That's not a good combination. Last year, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, affectionately known as NOAA, found that sea level rise is happening even faster than previously predicted. In fact, we could see a foot of sea level rise by 2050. Let me say that again. NOAA told us just about 2 or 3 months ago that we could see a foot of sea level rise by 2050 due to climate change. And that would be devastating to those of us in low-lying states and a lot of states that are not low-lying or coastal states. The climate crisis is already costing us a lot. How much? Well, NOAA last year found that there were 18 climate disasters in the United States with losses exceeding $1 billion each. That's $1 billion each. These costly extreme weather events were also seen throughout the globe, like record-breaking heat waves melting the pavement. I don't know if anybody here is a bicyclist, but you know, the big race in France every year, the Tour de France, and last year they had to delay parts of the race and move it around because the pavement was melting in France. You may have seen that in the news, but according to the latest report from U.S. through UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're currently on a path to reaching the critical tipping point of 1.5 degrees Celsius. You keep hearing about an increase in average global temperatures within the next decade. Louisiana, I don't know if we have anybody who's here from Louisiana, but in Louisiana they lose a piece of land every 100 minutes the size of a football field to the ocean. Every 100 minutes, a piece of land the size of a football field in Louisiana. All of us know that this is bad for business. It's bad for families. It's bad for all of us. And climate change threatens the stability of many critical industries, from agriculture to energy to tourism, and the list goes on. So what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Well, the solution is, I think, beginning to come a bit more clear over time. We need to transition our economy to run on cleaner energy to avoid, and it's not going to happen overnight. I know that. You know that. But it needs to happen. But we need to do that in order to eventually avoid a future plagued by climate-fueled extreme weather. We must build infrastructure today that puts us on a pathway to meet our nation's climate goals. Having said that, we made tremendous progress recently in supporting the deployment of clean energy across our country. Last Congress, we provided nearly $370 billion, that's with a B, $370 billion in clean energy and climate investments through tax incentives and grants and something called the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. And also, in addition to that, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which Shelley and I helped to write and managed on the Senate floor about 1.5 years ago. But we included in that, the legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the first ever climate title and a transportation reauthorization bill, and more than $20 billion in transportation climate investments, such as investments for electric vehicle charging stations and charging stations, as well as cleaner buses. In both of these laws, we included provisions to address some of the challenges slowing down the development of infrastructure projects in our country. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, we provided meaningful new authorities to facilitate more timely environmental reviews for infrastructure projects. For example, this law made the Federal Permit Improvement Steering Council permanent and expanded its authorities to reduce permitting timelines for large infrastructure projects. In addition to that, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we provided $1 billion to the federal agencies tasked with completing those reviews and permits. These additional resources will address longstanding agency staffing challenges and help expedite timelines. In turn, this will help deliver certainty and predictability for businesses in the permitting process, all the while preserving important environmental protection. And much of this work was led by our committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. And still, there's more we can do, must do, in order to improve our nation's environmental review procedures and support the deployment of clean energy. I'm confident that we can find a way forward by working together, and we look ahead for opportunities to build on this work. I believe that we should do so in a bipartisan way because, as I say almost every day, bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. If you walk away with nothing else out of here today, or remember today, just remember that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. Fortunately, we have examples of when Congress was able to pass reforms to our environmental laws on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the Environment and Public Works Committee that Shelley and I lead has led this type of work in recent weeks. Just last year, after years of work to phase down super-polluting refrigerants known as HFCs, higher fluorocarbons, they're about 1,000 times worse for global warming than carbon dioxide, HFCs. But along with my friend and our colleague from Louisiana, Senator John Neely Kennedy, a Republican, but a good buddy, helped lead our Senate colleagues in ratifying something called the Kigali Amendments to the Montreal Protocol. What does that do? It phases down the emissions of HFCs over about a 15-year period, and it reduces the threat of climate change and global warming. Just as one thing, phase down of HFCs over the next 15 or 20 years reduces by a ½ degree Celsius the threat that we face from climate change and global warming. Just as one thing. The United States Chamber of Commerce and many of you here today and that are not here today were critical partners in this effort for which Senator Kennedy and I will be forever thankful. The question is, can we do good things for this planet and provide jobs and economic opportunity? Yes. And this is like item number one, I would say, to look at it, keep in mind as a role model for us going forward. Earlier this year in his State of the Union, our president called on us to finish the job. In the EPW committee, we are planning to hold a number of hearings in the next couple of weeks. I think Shelley may have mentioned that, as we explore improving our nation's environmental permitting processes so that we can better support our transition to clean energy. We're also making sure that a wide array of stakeholders have a seat at the table as we work to build a new coalition of support to ideas that can make a real difference without undermining environmental protections. We'll be looking for feedback from many of you to make sure that we make reforms that are truly needed and provide the most benefit for the deployment of clean energy. And while there are always opportunities to improve our environmental protection, they're there for a reason. And we have to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. For example, the National Environmental Policy, or NEPA, helps the federal government make sound decisions. NEPA also gives communities, especially those impacted by infrastructure projects, an opportunity to make sure their voices are heard. In particular, we need to preserve opportunities for traditionally underserved communities to provide input. And these communities often bear the brunt of both the impacts of energy infrastructure and the impacts of climate change. We can preserve these opportunities and protections while also finding ways to give businesses greater certainty and greater predictability. Fortunately, the Biden administration is already working to fully deploy the investments that Congress has made without delay. The administration is also working to ensure that the federal agencies have the tools, the staff, and the procedures needed to do that work efficiently. Still, it's worth noting that this is a shared responsibility across all levels of government and in the private sector as well. After all, our states and local partners have review and approval authorities for many energy projects that can impact project timelines as much as federal reviews do. And we all know that businesses have a critical role in building out the clean energy infrastructure of our future. But it's also true that developers can make a huge difference by being good community partners and engaging with communities early and often to earn their support for projects. Businesses can also ease environmental reviews by making sound siting choices that avoid harm and by being good stewards of our environment and partners with our communities. Henry Ford once said, in fact, I'm going to have a quote from Henry Ford that I'm going to give in just a second. I'm going to put it in just a little bit later. But I would just say I want to invite all of you to work with us as Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate to identify and support real changes that can be embraced by various industries that are represented in the Chamber of Commerce, and as well as embraced by communities and environmentalists too. And I don't know if any of you remember things that your parents used to say to you, like when you were little kids growing up. I do. I have a whole list of them. I won't bore you with all of them. But I mentioned earlier, I go back and forth on a train almost every day, almost every night. And we were up all night, I think, working on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I caught a train the next morning at about daylight, about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, when we'd finished, and took a train and went home to Delaware. Got off the train, and on my way home, I went by a Wawa. I don't know if anybody here ever been to a Wawa, one or two. We love Wawa in Delaware, and we love Wawa all the way up and down the East Coast. And those of you on the West Coast, having lived in California, one of the things that can make California even better would be Wawa. But I stopped at Wawa. It's about 7 in the morning just to get a cup of coffee. And people are friendly, and I get a small cup of coffee. I go to the cash register to pay for it, and the cashier's woman said, "Senator, your money's no good here." And I said, "No, I've got to pay." And she said, "People standing around, I don't want them to think I'm a deadbeat." And I said, "No, I need to pay." And she said, "Senator, your money's no good here." And I said, I had a small cup of coffee, and I said to her, "Could I get a big cup of coffee then?" And she said, "No, your money's no good for a small cup of coffee, though." And she said, "I just want you to know, I know you've been up all night. I heard on the news." And she said, "I have a son and a daughter. And someday they'll be grown and on their way into the world." She said, "I want to make sure they have a planet to grow up on and a planet to grow old on." That's what she said. "I want to make sure they have a planet to grow up on and a planet to grow old on." And I said to her, "And I want to make sure when they grow up and grow old, as they grow up and grow old, I want to make sure they have a job. In fact, a series of jobs so that they can support themselves and their families." I mentioned earlier the 8 years I was privileged to be governor of Delaware. More jobs were created than a year period in the history of the state of Delaware. I did not create one of them. Did not create one of them. But in Delaware, we're really good at bipartisanship, really good. And some wonderful leaders, including a couple that I just mentioned before. But one of the things we're especially, I think, a joy at in Delaware is creating a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation. That's what we're I think very good at, creating an environment for job creation, job preservation. What does that include? It includes workforce. A workforce with the skills that are needed by employers from all walks of life. It includes public safety, so people can live in safety and walk our streets and go to our parks and not have to worry about their safety. It includes research and development that can be commercialized and turned into businesses and products and services. It includes access to capital. It includes access to decision makers, people like Shelley, like me. It includes access to foreign markets as well. And the nurturing environment includes protection of intellectual property. It includes open space and clean air and clean water and and beaches and oceans that we can and swim in and recreate in. Among the message I learned from my parents, from my dad, I just remember something mom or dad used to say over and over and over again. My sister and I do some boneheaded stunt. My dad would always say, just use some common sense. And he said it a lot. And he didn't say it so nicely. But he said, just use some common sense. He didn't pound anything else into our brains. That was one of them. Just use some common sense. My mother's a deeply religious woman. Dragged us to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and most Thursday nights. People say they don't have church on Thursday nights. Well, we did. And then we go home after Thursday night church, and we would watch Billy Graham on TV. But my mom wanted to make sure we embrace the golden rule, treat other people the way we want to be treated. Always put ourselves in other people's shoes and treat them that way. One of the others is a guy. I'll close with this. Just a guy, Albert Einstein. Believe it or not, he never rode Amtrak because we didn't have Amtrak when he lived. But he rode the train a lot, and he lived in Princeton, and he'd catch the train to go up to New York or the train to come down here. And did a lot. And one day he was waiting for the train in Princeton. The train stopped and picked up passengers. He got on board, and finds a seat, and he sits down. He starts looking in his coat and his pockets and his briefcase for his ticket. He can't find his ticket. And the conductor comes along and says, "Dr. Einstein, we know who you are. You don't have to worry about a ticket. You're good." And the conductor turns around and he starts to walk out of the car, and he gets to the other end of the car and turns around and he looks, and Dr. Einstein's down on the floor of the car looking for his ticket. The conductor rushes back to where Dr. Einstein is, and he says, "Dr. Einstein, you don't have to worry about your ticket. We know who you are. We know who you are." And Einstein, down on his hands and knees, looks up at the conductor and he says, "I know who I am too. I just don't know where I'm going." Well, I hope we're smart enough to figure out where we need to go. And we need permitting reform. We also need to have a planet that those kids that I talked about earlier can grow up on and grow old on, and go on to find good jobs so they can support themselves and their families. When I travel the country, I'll close with this. When I travel the country, I get to meet a lot of people. So do you. And when I meet people, one of the questions I love to ask people is, what gives you joy in your life? I ask that a lot. What gives you joy in your life? You know what I hear from most people? I like helping other people. I like helping other people. One of the best ways you can help other people is make sure they have a job so they can support themselves and their families. I used to think there was a verse of scripture in the Bible that said something like, if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach a person to fish, they can feed themselves for a lifetime. I've used that line over and over and over again over the years. And one night last week, after I used it in a speech, a minister came up to me after the speech and he said, "You know that line you used about, if you give a person a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a person a fish, you feed him for a lifetime." He said, "That's not in the Bible." "Really?" He said, "Really?" And I said, "Well, it should be. It should be." But I really do think we have the opportunity to teach people to fish and help them to fill a bunch of jobs that are going unfilled today, and do so in a way that helps all of us a whole lot. I would close by saying this. There's a quote about integrity. If we have it, nothing else matters. If we don't have it, nothing else matters. Think about that. Integrity. If we don't have it, nothing else matters. If we do have it, nothing else matters. The same is true of a strong economy and a planet that we can grow up and grow old on. Let's do both. Thanks so much.